so swiftly. So my talk is going to be the glass half full talk after listening to the previous one. So I'm going to be talking about unintended consequences. Now you might wonder why unintended consequences. And I guess the reason I chose to talk about this is because we as scientists describe problems and figure out ways in which you can deal with that. Economists and social scientists will develop approaches to managing these problems. But with every approach, there is usually an unintended consequence. So something will happen that you didn't mean or you didn't predict. So I'm going to be talking about that with everything we do, we have to think about the things that may happen as a consequence of the action we take. So I'll give you some examples and also a little bit of theory, which sort of sets up a little bit of the stuff that I'll be talking about later on about behavioural economics. So that's just a little example of an unintended consequence there. I know, it's a bit sad, isn't it, the giraffes? No. Okay. So when we think about unintended consequences, if I ask you to think about some management that has been done in relation to fisheries that had an unexpected effect. So for instance, and Juan Carlos mentioned yesterday that you work on MPAs, on marine protected areas, and effort. So basically what happens when you start a marine reserve in location A and you don't do anything about the number of people who fish there, so you have the same number of fishes but you exclude them from a certain area, the fishermen will go somewhere else, or the fisherwomen will go somewhere else. So even though you might protect the marine reserve and everything in it, and it'll flourish, the scientific outcomes will be fantastic, if you don't provide an option for the fishermen, you will increase the pressure somewhere else and probably cause damage in that other area. So the unintended consequence of only doing a marine reserve in one area and not thinking about that can be quite significant. So that's an example of an unintended consequence. So this is the definition. So basically, if we do purposeful action, there's outcomes that are not the ones that we want. And, one of the things that I didn't know, there's actually a law of unintended consequences, which says that any purposeful action by a business, a government, a person, an institution, there's always an effect that'll be unintended. It's inevitable. And we have to think about those. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit of history of the concept, but also how I became interested in unintended consequences. And it was a paper, when I first started working at CSIRO with Beth. Beth wrote this paper that some of you may know on human behaviour, the key source of uncertainty in fisheries management. It's quite a well-known paper. And when I started, Beth said to me, it came back from the reviewers, and one of the reviewers, and Rashid already mentioned, you have to love your reviewers, right? Yeah. So the reviewer said, you've used unintended consequence, but you haven't referenced it. We went, what do you mean, unintended consequence? It's just the word, right? I said, no, it's not just the word. It actually, someone owns that term. And again, Rashid mentioned before that you own a term for a while, but then it sort of disappears in the literature, right? But this was obviously social scientists. We had to reference unintended consequence. So I went and had a look. And in 1936, there was a gentleman by the name of Merton, Robert Merton. He wrote a paper that used the word unintended consequences in a social sort of context. So that was the paper we referenced, and the reviewer was happy after that. But this is Merton, and he wrote this essay on unintended consequences of social action. So he basically said this thing, that everything you do, it'll have a consequence. Now Merton, I always like a little bit of history when I look at something. Merton, he received the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1997, and he was also the same guy who started the word reference group. He came up with the thing that's called, how do you call it? forgotten the word now, but anyhow, he came up with several concepts that self-fulfilling prophecy, that's the one he also developed. So if you ever write a paper in which you write self-fulfilling prophecy, make sure you reference Mr. Merton here. But so he wrote this paper in 1936, which is the one that I ended up referencing. Now, I went to the internet and figured out what happened with unintended consequences in the literature, and as you can see, it's one of those concepts that's been increasingly referenced. Every second publication you pick up at the moment, it'll talk about an unintended consequence. There was a little dip in 2011 when Beth wrote her paper, but it's sort of picked up again after that. I'm sure that's not because of Beth, but but also it's got over 1,000 citations per year that mention unintended consequences. But as you can see here, it's not only in social sciences, but in all the different sciences people talk about unintended consequences. Now, after I found Mr. Merton in 1936, I realised that that was not the start of unintended consequences. Because here is John Locke. He is a philosopher, English philosopher in the 17th century. And basically, one of the things he said was when the English Parliament wanted to reduce the official interest rate, so they set the interest rate from 6 to 4% to make it possible for poor people to access loans, he said, that's a good idea, but it won't work because the banks will circumvent. They'll make sure that they'll circumvent this rule, and because you're restricting access to capital by reducing the interest rate, it'll actually become more difficult for poor people to access loans. So he foresaw the unintended consequence of a management action to make capital available for poor people. I don't actually know whether they took notice or not, but so that's a case of an unintended consequence. Then there was a French economist, Frédéric Bastiat, who basically wrote a book which Laurent might correct me here, ce qu'on voit, ce qu'on ne voit pas. That's what's seen and that's what's not seen. He basically said there's two sorts of economists. There's good ones and bad ones. The good ones? But he said the good economists will see the bad economists will see what's visible. The good economists will see what's visible and what's invisible. So good economics will basically look at the things that you can predict, and then it'll look at the long term, it'll look at first and second order effects, and the things that are unforeseen or unintended. So this is in the 1900s. So it's been around for a long, long time, right? And here I am, 300 years later, still talking about unintended consequences. That's it. Now everyone knows how old I am too. I did that very quickly, didn't I? Okay, so now I'm going to go a little bit into the theory. That was just the background of unintended consequences. So say you are going to deal with a problem in the ocean. So you're going to develop a management approach, say to overfishing. Okay, so there's two outcomes. You implement a management approach and your outcome can be achieved or you cannot achieve it, right? It just go wrong. If you don't achieve it, you might have government failure, as they call it in economics. Then you do your action and there's a consequence, right? So this is the inevitable unintended consequence that you may or may not be aware of. It can be bad or it can be good. So basically what we have four possibilities. We have a possibility where you have done something about managing the ocean, you've achieved it, and something else happened that you didn't think of that was good. So it's a bonus. You get something extra. Here you have a management action that you've achieved your aim for, but something happened that you didn't predict or that you weren't aware of, and it was bad. That's what they call a drawback. So you've got something good, but something bad happened as well. Then here we didn't achieve what we got, so we didn't actually manage we didn't solve the problem of the ocean, but as a consequence of what we did, something good happened. So that's a lucky miss, really. We didn't achieve what we set out, but something good happened at the same time. And this one here is a perverse result. Basically, we didn't get what we wanted, and something bad happens as well. So these are all possible. These are all possible outcomes of ocean management that we do. Now, these perverse results in economics, they call them government failure, but also it's called to as the Barbara Streisand effect. Now, has anyone heard of this? No. So I'll tell the little anecdote, because basically Barbara Streisand owned a house in Malibu, and somebody published, there was a website that had photos of houses in Malibu, and she sued the persons that published the photos of Malibu, because she said, I don't want my photo of my house on the website, on the internet. Before she sued, 4 or 5 people had downloaded the photo. Hardly anyone, right? After she sued, 14,000 people downloaded that image in the first week, right? So basically, her action to prevent people from seeing her house had a perverse result, because everyone downloaded the photo. So that's why they call it the Barbara Streisand effect. And she lost the case. She had to pay as well. So
tell me you have that photo now.
No, I don't. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have thought about it.
This is why so many people did after she said.
Sorry?
This is why so many downloaded it, because they could almost guess she would lose it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
go for the money. You want to fight with a person like that.
Yeah. I think it's just such a nice irony. Yes. So I'm going to give you an example of each one of those. And the reason I'm talking about this is for you to keep in mind that these unintended consequences have always been there. They've been talking about it for over 300 years. But I think we can get better at predicting them. And we can get better at predicting them by using interdisciplinary knowledge in the room. And not only do I think that we can become better at that by using everyone's knowledge, but if we use more knowledge from the people who currently we don't get a lot of knowledge from, just like if you think about people in the room here, there's no psychologists in the room, right? We happen to have a philosopher and a lawyer, which is pretty unusual. We also don't have a lot of behavioural economists, people who use insights into the way we operate and the way we make decisions, aside from obviously normal economists, etc. So there's a couple of disciplines that we haven't quite engaged with, in my opinion, to the fullest extent. We need to be better at incorporating other knowledge as well. So, okay, so I'm going to give you the examples. I forgot to put this slide after this one. So Merton was he didn't get the Nobel Prize for nothing, I suppose, because he said, okay, we've got unintended consequences, and I'll give you 5 reasons why they happen. And these were the 5 reasons that he gave. And if you go to the literature now, these 5 reasons all still stand. Basically, people ignore things because of ignorance. Now, ignorance is can be a lack of information, it can be ignoring information, etc. It can be willful ignorance. Now, the difference between ignorance and willful ignorance is that you actually do something willfully, so you, like a politician, ignoring information because it suits them. But willful ignorance also includes, it's a little bit puzzling because you can see that somebody ignores information, but sometimes people ignore information and they don't actually know they're ignoring it, but it's willful. So that's a lot of the cognitive bias stuff comes in there, and I'll talk about cognitive bias a bit later. So another reason is that things are just complicated, and complex systems theory tells us that things are complicated. We can't always know everything, but we can become better at trying to figure out complex systems. Then there's this one here, which is basic values. So if you think about, values are always a little bit difficult to explain, but if you think about religion, for instance, there's reasons why some people don't do things or do things based on their basic value system, their social norms, etc. So things may be unintended consequences might be ignored because of basic norms. And then the last one is a self-defeating prediction. which is the opposite of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Basically, you say something now, and by saying something now, you prevent it from happening in the future. So, and I'll give you an example of that. So my take on this is that everything really is related back to information. And information and communication is what we're talking about today. So again, that ignorance, lack of information, inaccurate information, information that's conveyed in the wrong way can create unintended consequences. Ignoring information, suppressing information, complexity of information, time inconsistency information, everything comes back to information and how we provide it. And then basic values and social norms sort of sits a little bit outside of that. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of drawbacks. Remember that one in the corner where we wanted to do something, we were successful at doing it, but there was an unintended consequence. So, and I'm going to give you the most obvious example, which is ITQs, individual tradable quota. Does everyone know what individual tradable quota is? I see, no, okay, so I'll quickly explain it to you. Do people know what a total allowable catch is? Catch shares or whatever, yeah. So basically, we have fish in the sea and we say, okay, there's, for instance, with cod, you can catch 1,000 tonnes of, I'm grabbing these figures out of the air, right? But you can only catch 1,000 tonnes of cod each year, the whole fishery. So the biologists go away and assess how many fish are in the sea, how many we should catch to be able to do it sustainably, and the limit is 1,000. Then what we say is, okay, so we have 100 fishermen and we have 1,000 tonnes of cod to share. So we're going to give each of these fishermen a catch share of an amount of the total number of cod that we sustainably catch. So we've given each of these fishermen an amount of the catch, and now what we say to these fishermen, okay, if you're not using your catch, then you could lease it out to someone else, or you could sell it to someone else. So you can trade your quota. So that was an approach that was developed by economists, and New Zealand is, I think, one of the first places that actually implemented tradable quota. And so if you have 2 objectives in the fishery, you have an environmental objective, which you can achieve by putting a cap on your catch. So you're saying, okay, 1,000 is sustainable, so that achieves my environmental objective, which is a sustainable fishery. Individual tradable quota were implemented because it was achieving an economic objective. It would make the fishery more efficient. Because if you think about economic efficiency, I'll keep pointing at you because you're looking at me, you're the closest to me, but I'm sorry about that, I don't want to pick on you. But so say we're both in this fishery together with other people, but only we matter, of course. And you're a really good fisher, and I'm a not so good fisher. I've got 100 tonnes of quota, and you've got 50 tonnes of quota. So you say to me, and I say, well, look, I really don't want to go fishing this year. And you say, well, I'll have that fishing. And I say, well, I'll sell it to you. So you buy my quota, because you're a much better fisherman than me. So what happens is over time, this is what economic theory predicts, is that the people who are the more efficient fishermen, I keep saying men as well, but obviously fishers. Yes, sorry. Yeah. Will gather their quota and increasingly own more and more quota. So that is actually economically efficient because you're the much better fisherman than me. So there's efficiency gains, as they call it. So that's what happens in fisheries that are managed by a total allowable catch and an individually tradable quota. So you get environmental sustainability, economic efficiency. But one of the things that happens is that as quota trades, there's some people that are going to be missing out because this is a valuable asset, right? I've got this asset in my hand that I can sell, and now you've got it, and it increases in value. If I want to come into that fishery, I'm not going to be able to afford to buy quota. If I don't own quota, I'm not allowed to fish. Is that equitable? It's a question, right? There's social scientists that are saying in fisheries that are managed by ITQs, the social implications of that aren't always equitable. You get concentration of quota ownership, and so the more quota you own, there can be quota imbalances and power imbalances, etc. So an unintended consequence of achieving environmental sustainability and economic efficiency in a fishery can be that there's social implications. So that's a really classic example of an unintended consequence that as scientists we should think about when we manage our resources. This picture was up before, and I was fascinated by your talk about co-management and things like that. One of the things, but in most places it works absolutely fantastic. One unintended consequence of co-management. In places like Australia, what's happened, if you have a fishery that has a total allowable catch and individual tradable quota, where there's concentration of ownership, if there's co-management, what happens is that the fishermen who own quota and the scientists and the managers, they all sit in a room together and they decide on next year's or this year's total allowable catch. So they're co-managing the fishery. They're all making the decisions together. Now you can imagine that if you're all sitting in a room and I'm a fisherman and I started off with 100 tonnes and now I own half of this fishery, my bargaining power is pretty good, right? And so what's happening over time as these fisheries, as these quota systems mature, is through quota, to the concentration of quota ownership, some people become very powerful. And the same people are in the room, right? So what's happening in these sorts of fisheries is that the power imbalances in the room have actually caused the total allowable catches to be set higher than originally advised by the scientists. Because of the power it plays in the room, it turns out that in these co-management systems, as they evolve over time, you have to start thinking about the fact that these powerful fishes, or processors for that matter, keep pushing up the quota, the total allowable catch, which is not so good for the environment.
Depends on how many other aspects of it.
Obviously. Yeah, there's all sorts of provisos to this. These are sort of these are gross generalisations, and I can be pulled down on any of these, so please do. But yeah, so it's always context specific. But it's just something to think about, right? It's something to think about, that power and co-management can have an unintended consequence and could, in some cases, lead to some not so sustainable outcomes. I'm going much too slow, aren't I? Another example of a drawback. This has happened in a couple of places. Again, it's the example of introducing a total allowable catch and individual tradable quota. When in New Zealand, the government said, okay, we're going to do something about our problems in this fishery. We're going to introduce ITQs, and you're going to be allocated. So the question then is, okay, you've got 1,000 tonnes of cod, and in 2 years' time, I'm going to give each one of the people who are participating in this fishery some of the share of that catch. Okay, now, on what basis are you going to allocate that? On what basis are you going to say, you get 20%, you get 5, you get 1, you get 50? Most fisheries, what they've done is when they introduce it, they base it on your catch history, right? So they say, okay, for the last 5 years, your catch has been 5 tonnes, your catch has been 10 tonnes, so you're going to get the equivalent of 10 tonnes and you'll get the equivalent of 5 tonnes. So proportional based on what you've done in the past. Is that fair? Maybe fair. So that's what most people have done, right? Or most fisheries have done. So two things happened. And this is that thing by telling things too early, that the opposite of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the fishermen, they're not stupid, right? They went, in 2 years' time, I'm going to get a proportion of that catch. I might just increase my catch in these last 2 years so that I can get a bigger proportion of that catch. And that is what happened. So they were anticipating it's what you can expect, right? If you know a little bit about psychology, yeah, you can probably think that's the case. But the other unintended consequence that happened at the same time was actually a bonus, because what happened was is that people don't always report their catches accurately. And when they realised that this quota system was going to be introduced in 2 years' time, they said, oh, you better tell the truth. You better tell them.
Or more than the truth. They
Over
can
the
get in
truth.
trouble, right?
Yes.
There's something called more than the truth. You catch 50 and you say you catch 10, over-report 100. They over-report, essentially. That's more than, it's all the discrepancy.
So again, sorry. Yeah, so it's interesting that and it's good to do that mental exercise, right? And I always do this thing where I think, what would I do if I was going to benefit? Yeah, what would I do? I thought, oh, I'd probably increase my cash, right? So that's always a good sort of. So there's 3 examples of drawbacks where the actual aim of the management approach worked, because we have more sustainable fisheries, we have better economic sort of outcomes for some of the fisheries, but we have all these things that have been drawbacks of those systems. Now I want to tell you an interesting one about a perverse result, where something that doesn't happen. And this is one that's anecdotal, but I have it on good evidence. It's related to MSC. Does everyone know what Marine Stewardship Council certification is? For those who are not nodding, it's basically where an organisation checks whether the fishery is doing things sustainably, both from an environmental, social and economic perspective. And the consumers in Europe often will want fish that is certified as MSC, that is certified environmentally sustainable. And they'll pay a higher price for that. So if you have a fish that's not certified and you have one that's certified, because you ethically feel that and you care about the environment, you're willing to pay a little bit more for that certified fish. So in Holland they have fisheries that are certified, MSC certified, and in Holland they have a system where the fish is sold by Dutch auction. Anyone know what a Dutch auction is? No. You know what an auction is?
Yes.
Okay. So the price goes up in an auction, right? You start at the bottom and you end up, the people with the highest price, the bidder with the willingness to pay the most bids, that gets the highest price. In a Dutch auction, the price actually starts at the top, at a price that no one would be willing to pay. And it drops. So there's a clock. You can see the clock, they're electronic now, but basically they fall. So they'll start, say you're selling, again they'll start with cod. You start with $10 a kilo. No one's willing to pay that. The clock goes down, 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 down. Okay, I want to pay $6.50 a kilo, so I press the button and I get the fish. So it's like a closed bid system, right? And it works really well because the person who presses first gets the fish. So and you don't have to reveal the price that you're willing to pay. That's why it's like a closed bid system. And I have a theory about why it was developed in Holland. Being Dutch, I can say that. My theory is that the Dutch are known to be very stingy. And I think psychologically, if you see something decrease in price, psychologically you think, oh, I'm getting a bargain here. But obviously you're not. But I think that's my theory about why it was developed in Holland. Okay, so what happens here is that the clock starts to fall and the buyer, say, pays $1.30 for this fish that's MSC certified. 10 cents of that price goes to the MSC certification organisation, and the fisher who puts up this fish, who goes and catches fish, only gets $1.20. Right? Now, the buyer doesn't distinguish, well, he can sell the certified fish for more than more than non-certified fish. But they just wait for that clock to go down, right? And they'll wait as long as they want. They're not necessarily willing to pay more for the certified versus uncertified fish. And because there is, so as a fisherman, I've got a box of certified fish and a box of uncertified fish, right? I put my box of certified fish up, I'm going to pay 10 cents of that will go to the MSC. So if there's no MSC and the buyer pays the same, the fisher receives 10 cents more. So as a fisher, I would go, I'll probably just sell this box of, I can sell this box as MSC certified, but I think I'll just sell it uncertified because I'm more likely to get $1.30 rather than $1.20. So what's happening in this market is that counterintuitively, there's increasingly more fish sold as uncertified fish, whereas it could be sold as certified fish. Now in the long run, that can cause problems for the MSC certification, right? Because they're not getting their 10 cents. But there's no incentive for these fishermen to actually sell their fish as certified fish. So again, this is anecdotal, but I have it in good evidence from the people who are working on that auction system. Yes, please.
I just wonder how likely is it that one fisherman has the two types of product, like certified and non-certified fish, from the same boat? Is that common?
Yes, it is common. Well, you can sell all his catches certified, but usually they sell some of their catches uncertified and some of their certified because of the different retail outlets and the different demands, right? Not everyone wants to buy certified fish. So they can just, if it's, say, the cod industry is certified, then this fisher person could sell all their catches certified, but usually they don't because of the fact that demand is not all for certified. But you would think intuitively, because it gets a higher price in the market, that there's more incentive for them to sell it certified. But in fact, it's not turning out to be the case because of the way it is sold, because of the auction system and the buyers not being, they're just waiting for that clock to fall. They're just waiting for the lowest price they can get. So, yeah.
But as far as I know, you also can certify the fishery entirely, like, and it's not in the price you pay an MSC to certify this fishery. They say yes, it's certified or not, depending on the program that they use. They have the standardized. Yeah. And then it's not in the price you pay for this certification.
No, but I'm not sure.
I mean, it's not in the price of your selling.
The 10 cents, you mean?
Yeah.
The 10 cents is between the buying, the traded price and what the fisherman gets. So they just, the auction company, the company that auctions all the fish, will take the 10 cents and give it to the
it's in another way, like you pay an amount to the MSC to certify.
Get certified.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's take it the same seller to have the logo as to pay a fee to MSC as well.
Yeah.
The final seller.
Yeah.
In the market has to pay a fee as the logo. It's not only the fishery that pays for the certification, it's also the seller.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I think another maybe unintended consequence, for example, around MSC could be that it is increasingly becoming an exclusionary scheme, wherein maybe like smaller players are excluded because of the increasing the high prices of getting certified and the cumbersome work of getting specialists to come and certify your fishery annual or every other year. But then the other thing also, it could be the driver of IUU. For example, the fishery that cannot be certified, then the alternative supply channels get activated. For example, there is a thing that one has said that the demand of the fish that is not certified is actually increased in Asia as a result of the shift in the market, whatever that was channeled for the European market, and due to the MSC certification requirement, is now channeled to other areas, which has now increased the demand in those areas, and to the detriment sometimes of the resource.
Yeah, interesting. So that's a clear unintended consequence, right?
I think.
Yeah.
Is part of the reason for that because the fishers only have access to markets that are MSC oriented, like European markets? So it forces them to go into these dark channels?
I don't know. I think it has to do with the incentive.
Yeah.
If you are going to lose 10 cents for every kilogram, and on the alternative channels you get probably save that 10 cents. It's a small difference, but it could be much bigger, although the risk sometimes could be much higher.
Yeah. But, so okay. There is many retailers, the big ones like Walmart, etc. They're shifting all their seafood production to sustainable, and so MSC is one of the most popular. So when you have, for example, Walmart, I don't know, Central America, anywhere, that you don't actually have many or any fishery that is MSC, you have to start importing from other places, and that's when the local fisheries then, when they used to sell to that Walmart, they can't sell it anymore because of how they require MSC all the fisheries.
I'm going to continue on. It's a really interesting discussion. I think the whole MSC discussion is a very interesting one to have because I think it's worth talking through all those aspects of things that might happen as a consequence of creating exclusivity, if you like. Anyhow, so I'm going to just two more examples. This is, I have to talk about this one because this is an example of a lucky miss, I've called it. So this is Chris's work in Ningaloo. Huh?
It's our work.
Well, yes. Well, if you're first of all, you're see.
Ningaloo's a bit further north.
Hey?
You've got it on
Yeah, no, I got it on. I realised that I got it on the wrong spot. Yeah, but it sort of matched nicely with the arrows. But basically, and Chris is better at explaining this than me, but there was a lot of money spent in this area to close that science policy gap, to basically get the managers to use the science that was being done in a place further north of where I've put the dot. So when Chris started researching it, it turned out that this science policy gap hadn't actually been patched. The scientists or the policymakers weren't taking up a lot more of the science that was being done in Ningaloo. What did happen though was that the science that was being done increased the trust in science in the local communities, and it made it a lot more visible. So that's the really short story of that. So even though the intent of all that expenditure of decreasing filling that science policy gap did not happen, it did actually increase the trust in the local community in science. I'll skip through this one because that's not really that. So what I've been saying is that these unintended consequences are inevitable. They'll happen. We need to realise that they will happen, and we need to become better at predicting them or anticipating them, as I've said. Even though somebody talked about it 300 years ago, it means that we're still working on doing it better, and I think that we can if we get better at anticipating the behavioural science and the stuff related to information and social norms. So when Merton published his paper, he talked about unintended consequences, but he also talked about unanticipated consequences. And so he also distinguished between the fact that they can be unintended, but some are unanticipated that could be unanticipated. But surprisingly, that literature did not develop at all. People did not take it up. They probably liked the word unintended consequence, but unanticipated didn't have that same ring to it. So it didn't quite take off there, but maybe we can make that happen now, I think. Okay, so I'm going to give you some compliance examples to show you where behavioural science can be helpful in better anticipating things. So these are the areas of MPAs in the world, the marine parks, and there's over 15,000 marine reserves throughout the world. just over 7% of the global oceans are protected, and just over 2% of those are no-take zones. So that's just to give you a picture of that. The Great Barrier Reef, big marine park over here, and there's an organisation called the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, which is the local authority that manages the Great Barrier Reef. They had so they've got no-take zones in the Great Barrier Reef, and they did an information campaign to talk to the community about how good these green zones, as they call them, were these no-take zones. So they told everyone of how good the environment in these green zones was. The fish were growing, there was lots of fish, the abundance was high, diversity was high, all this good stuff about what was happening in the reserves. And then when they went to have a look at compliance, whether people were breaking the rules with the reserves, one of the main drivers for breaking the rules was that these fishermen who were going to break the rules, they knew the fishing was really good in these reserves. So the information had the unintended consequence of actually encouraging this behaviour, because this information that was being put out was all saying, look how good the fishing is in the reserve, only you could go fishing there. So the people who were going to break the rules were breaking the rules because they actually had been given this information about how good the fishing was. So knowledge in this case, or information, was a double-edged sword. In a sense, they were providing information that they thought would be good to encourage people to care about these reserves, but in fact it didn't have that exact consequence. But there was other things. So if you're going to break the rules, there are two things that will guide whether you're going to break the rules or not. Is how big the fine is that you're going to get if you get caught, and the other one is how likely are you to get caught. Now, these two things are the main determinants of breaking the rules in fishing or not. But there's several other things that will guide you whether you break the rules or not. And it goes back to a theory that lots and lots of people use. This is a very sort of a behavioural model that is used in social sciences that it can explain a lot of the behaviour you show. And it is very good at explaining non-compliance, as I've called it. So this is the start of the behaviour is that this is a theory of reason action. It was 1980, Ashton and Fishbein. So basically, we have certain attitudes. So that's the way you negatively or positively reason about the behaviour. And then there's this thing called a subjective social norm. Now, a social norm is something like, for instance, in Indonesia, giving someone a hug might not be the norm, right? Might not be something that you do socially. Or like in India, you don't pat people on the head. That's considered rude. That's a social norm. You don't do that. In Australia, when I first got there, I was surprised to find out that people don't always shake hands. And when I first got there 25 years ago, in fact, the men would shake hands, but then the men wouldn't shake hands with the women. So when you walk into a room, you would stand there and just stand there like that. Yeah. Which, like in Holland, everyone shakes hand, and the second time you meet them, you kiss them, right? And I guess that's the same in a lot of... So that's a social norm. That's something that's socially acceptable in society.
The Latinos just go straight to the kissing.
Yeah, I know. It's a good thing, isn't it? So those two things will guide whether we intend to do certain behaviour, and then whether we have an intention will then mean whether we're going to do that behaviour or not, so whether we're going to comply or not. So this really basic theory or model was then built upon by Ashton again, and he inserted this thing called perceived behaviour control. So we don't always have control over whether we can comply or not. So sometimes sometimes we don't always have control over whether we can do that behaviour. So there might be money, or there might be other things that prevents us. So that's sort of the perceived, whether we have control over that or not. And then there's an extension to that, which is a social norms theory, is that in fact these social norms, so the things that work in society, are actually guided by what we call descriptive social norms and injunctive social norms. So these are the perceptions of the behaviours that everyone does. So we all think about how, for instance, in Australia, people will generally not shake hands. So I'll keep with the shaking hands. So we have a perception of what the social norm is. So that's our descriptive social norm. And then we have an injunctive social norm, is that we have a belief about whether other people believe that the behaviour is right or not. So I have a perception of the fact that most people who move to Australia will probably think that that non-shaking hands behaviour is not such a good thing. So I have an idea about what other people think about that social norm. Does that make sense? It's a little bit confusing, but so that's two parts of the social norms. So as it turns out, in fisheries, in terms of compliance, there's the deterrence, as I said, there's the fine and how likely you are to get caught. But a lot of fisheries compliance can actually be explained by the social norm. So in this example in the Great Barrier Reef, that the people who were fishing illegally, people who were fishing legally, they thought that a much higher percentage of people were fishing illegally than actually was. So that was their subjective social norm. They thought that more people were fishing illegally than actually the case was. And those who fished illegally overestimated the number of people who acted the same as them, and the people who did not fish illegally thought that more people were fishing illegally than really were. So these are related to the way that the perceptions we have of how society works. And then there was people who knew someone who was fishing illegally had a high propensity to think that other people were fishing illegally as well. So they had a high propensity to do it themselves, and that was social learning. So basically, social norms guide a lot of the behaviour that you see in compliance in fisheries. So if we know something about social theory and the way that people behave, we can better anticipate how people will behave in terms of compliance in fisheries as well. So this is a similar example from a commercial fishery, and I'll stop after this example because I had many more slides, but I've been going much slower than I should have done. This is again a compliance example that's from New Zealand, and they have a blue cod fishery. And they basically have two different regulations, and they wanted to figure out whether people complied with those regulations and what influenced their compliance with those regulations. So they have daily bag limits, so where you are allowed a number of fish per day, and they had a size limit. Now usually size limits are for different reasons. Size limits are usually to prevent females being taken out before they can breed, etc. So in this fishery, again, the same model. It's a very simple model, but it's very, very powerful. When it was about daily bag limits, people's compliance behaviour, whether they obeyed with the rules or not, was again guided by the subjective social norm. But with daily bag limits, the perceptions of whether the majority of other fishers complied had a great influence in whether they complied themselves. And the beliefs whether other fishers approved of non-compliance or not also had an effect on whether they complied themselves or not. So these subjective social norms mattered in the compliance behaviour. When it came to size limits, the same perceptions mattered, but the belief of whether other fishers approved or not had a greater effect on them complying themselves than in the daily bag limits. And in fact, with size limits, if they were aware of the problem, they had a feeling of guilt which guided their attitudes, which then guided their behavioural intention. So with these two different management approaches, the feeling of guilt and the fact that this one here, whether other people approved of their behaviour or not, guided whether they complied more than with the daily bag limit, is interesting, because if you think about it, if you take a fish that hasn't bred yet, you might have some sort of sense of responsibility that you haven't let that female fish swim until she can breed. Whereas with the daily bag limit, it's not as obvious that there's a relationship between interfering in the biological process. So that feeling of guilt of doing the wrong thing was more obvious with the size limit than with the bag limit. So, and as I said, I'll stop here because basically this is an introduction to the rest of the 2 or 3 other talks that I'll be doing, where I'll be talking about the way that attitudes, social norms and other behavioural aspects that are observable can influence the way we manage our fisheries and our oceans. So I'll leave it there. Yeah?